Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to introduce the one, the only Tim Ball. There he is. If you don't know who Tim Ball is, he's a friend of the channel. He's an author. He is also Chief Science Advisor of the International Climate Science Coalition and a policy advisor at the Heartland Institute. He has a doctorate in climatology from the University of London, Queen Mary College, England, and Dr. Ball's comprehensive background in the field includes a strong focus on the reconstruction of past climates, just like Diamond. So my background is in paleoclimatology through stratigraphy, and I'm sure Tim attacks it through other data sets, including proxy data, because I've seen some of the graphs he uses. But more importantly, we both care about the impact of climate change on human history, the historical documentation of this climate change, and how it relates to our future. And Tim has been uncovering the fraud of global warming for years. He has some best-selling titles here. They all get 4.5 stars. I don't know if he wants you to buy them on Amazon, but that's where I'm showing you them. They're almost free. Look at this. The 2014 book, The Deliberate Corruption of Climate Science, is only $10. It used to be $22. Look at that. Good job, Tim, getting it out to all the people that need it. And his newest book here, Human-Caused Global Warming, the biggest deception in history, was the topic we talked about a year ago on the last show. You can get that on Kindle for $5.99. And we were just talking before the show, and Tim says he's writing another book. Welcome to the show, Tim, and is it true you're writing another book?
Yes, and thank you for having me back, David. I'm writing another book about the paradigm of environmentalism, this vehicle which is the perfect vehicle for promoting socialism. And by the way, the first person to do that was Adolf Hitler. Hitler used the environmental issue to pull people together. And of course, don't forget,
Oh, we lost Tim here. Bear with us. He's probably coming back. Can you hear me, Tim?
yes, I can hear you.
Okay, so start over. We lost connection. I apologize.
That's okay. No, what I was I got into the environment game a long time ago, and the climate about the same time, and in fact, I've been in the climate issue so long. When I started out, global cooling was the consensus, and fortunately it wasn't used for a political agenda as global warming has been, and that's the frightening part of it. But there was concern back in the 70s because the world had cooled down from 1940 to 1980, and there was concern about food production and social unrest and so on. And then I watched it switch over in the 1980s to global warming, and then it got grabbed as a political agenda, and of course we end up with the absolute mess of lies. In fact, I say it's the largest fake news story of all time, and perpetuated almost exclusively by the bureaucrats, particularly at the United Nations and in each national weather office. And they're the ones that are perpetuating all the lies about it. But the other point I want to make is that society changes. It goes from one paradigm to another. And when a new paradigm comes in, there are some people that grab it and exploit it, and make good use of it for political or financial reasons. But the majority of people are saying, well, look, it sounds like a good idea, but how far do we go with this? What's the role of this? And then fortunately, what happens is the extremists take it so far that the ordinary person starts to say, no, hang on a minute. Now we're losing more than we're gaining. The classic examples, of course, in the 20th century of these new paradigms, the first one was feminism. And feminism was an absolutely necessary change in society. Still change is required. But the majority of women were saying, well, how far do we go with this? And then the extremists started doing things like burning bras and so on. And the majority of women were saying, no, 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 sorry, now we're losing more than we're gaining. Well, the second biggest paradigm shift or claim in the 20th century was environmentalism. And it started, we can put it almost to a specific date, David, of April the 22nd in 1972. And if you look that up, that's the original Earth Day. Paul Ehrlich at Stanford University, and he's still around giving out his lies and misinformation.
Bear with us. Tim will be right back. He's all the way up in Vancouver, British Columbia, I believe. So we'll just give him a minute. It seems like we're cycling through some satellite delay. Tim, are you back?
I'm on here, yes.
Okay, great. So we heard everything except the last minute, and I want to just jump in here. A lot of people are picking up on the presentation that you and a good friend of ours, Tony Heller, did over in Australia in front of the government there, I believe, about a year ago, maybe 2 years ago. And absolutely nothing came of it. But now it's like public record, and probably hundreds of thousands of people have seen that presentation. And even recently, Tony Heller has done, I think in the last 24 hours, an excellent presentation to show how the manipulation of the climate data through time has been progressively done right before our very eyes. Now, with all of these facts in front of us, it is becoming clearer and clearer that what you're saying is obviously the truth. The paradigm shift was in 1972. By 1990, when I was at university, Tim, we were having discussions at the graduate level on how we were going to change our research topics to add global warming, because that was the only place the money was. So, but 2 decades later, it was entrenched in academia, and now 3 decades after that, what has become of science, let alone policy?
Well, this was always my concern. My concern initially was in the climate change and the global warming misinformation, and then, of course, on a larger scale, the environmental. But my current concern, and has been so probably for the last 5 or 6 years, is that when people find out how much they've been lied to, and when I say lied to, not just about the climate, but every single environmental issue. When I was just talking about example, you can go down the list: desertification, deforestation, sea level rise. There is no data for any of these things. There's no substance to any of them. And yet people believe that these are facts and the truths. And so what's happening is that they used environmentalism for a political agenda. I mean, Elaine Dewar spent 5 days with Maurice Strong, who was the architect of all of this. She spent 5 days with him at the UN. And after the 5 days, she concluded that Maurice Strong was using the environment as a vehicle for a one world government.
One world government. Clearly, I'm putting words in his mouth as we cycle through the delay. I apologize, and Tim will be back in just one moment. Yeah, you have a poor connection over there, but you just ended, the last word we heard was one world government.
Yeah, well, was Elaine Dewar, who and this is a very important book, but she spent 5 days with Maurice Strong, who was the architect of all of this, and we could just go through that very briefly. But she spent 5 days with him at the UN. Now, Dewar. And this, what's important about her book was she was an investigative journalist, and she wanted to write a book about praising Canadian environmentalists like David Suzuki and Maurice Strong and Elizabeth May and so on. So it was as if somebody was to write a book in the United States, writing praise of Greenpeace and all the rest of it. But what Dewar found, the more research she did, the more she discovered that these people were more corrupt and more political and more deceitful than the people that they were attacking. And so she ended up writing the book called Cloak of Green, in which she exposed all these people. She exposed the fact that Elizabeth May, for example, who was a scientist working for the government of Canada, but was secretly feeding all of the secret government documents to Greenpeace and Sierra Club over dams being built in Saskatchewan. And she spent 5 days with Maurice Strong in New York at the UN. And when she said to him, well, you know, what do you want to do? What's the problem? He said, the problem for the planet are the industrialized nations, and isn't it our responsibility to get rid of them? Well, of course, she said, well, then why don't you run for politics? And he said, oh, you can't do anything as a politician, which is probably the only true thing he ever said. She said, well, what are you going to do? How are you going to shut down the industrialized nations? And this is why, by the way, the CO2 and all of the Kyoto is attacking the United States. But he said to her, I'm going to go to the United Nations because I can raise my own money from whoever I like. He said, I can raise my own money from whomever I like, appoint anyone I want, and control the agenda. And at the end of the 5 days at the UN with Maurice Strong, Dewar concluded Strong was using the UN as a platform to sell a global environment crisis and the global governance agenda. And that's exactly what he did. And you have to, one of the things that...
Tim's frozen up again. Bear with us. I'll probably edit these out, Tim. So no big deal. You just froze up at one of the big things, which is your conclusion here.
Okay. Yeah. Are we ready to go?
Yeah.
Okay. What I was talking about was, if you look at the people that have changed the whole world, and they tend to be single name people like Napoleon and Lenin and so on, none of them have changed it for the good. Not one. The only one, and I know a lot of scientists get angry when I talk about this, but the only one that did change the world for good was Jesus. But that's not allowed to be said. But one of the things that you've got to remember is that Hitler and Mao were incredibly intelligent people, and frighteningly intelligent. Just because you're evil doesn't mean to say you're stupid. And so this is what was true of Maurice Strong. I mean, you take the idea of, well, the problem for the planet is the industrialized nations, and isn't it our responsibility to get rid of them? Well, how do you go about doing that? How would you even start? This is the genius of these people. This is the genius of these people, that they can implement plans to achieve their goals, and they can do it by affecting the whole world. And so what Maurice Strong did was that, as I said, he went... You okay?
Yeah, we're good.
Yeah, okay, he went to the UN and set up the United Nations Environment Program, and from that came Agenda 21, which of course is the application, the basis of environmentalism as the basis for a political agenda for one world government, and that is still in play. One of the things, and people say, well, it's not, it's an option. Agenda 21 is optional. But if you remember the comment that Maurice Strong elicited from Gro Harlem Brundtland, who was the prime minister of I think it was Norway at the time, and she said in her report that we've got to think globally and act locally. Well, that's exactly what's going on right now. Because if you look around the world, and a year ago in San Francisco, the United Nations sponsored, to the tune of over $1 billion, a conference of municipal leaders from all over the world on how to introduce the climate action plan. And you look at any municipality across the world.
Oh, he froze up again. Bear with us. Are you there? Yeah.
Yeah. Let me know when you're ready to go.
Yeah, we're ready. Hey, Tim.
Okay.
So this agenda is being laid out for globalism. Clearly. You don't need to sell it. You do need to write a book on it, though. But what is the purpose? Is this to enrich the people that are organizing it? Is that solely the purpose? Because it will not benefit humanity.
This is the interesting thing. There's people think that it's all about the money. For some people, it is about the money. But you get above a certain level, and it's all about the power. And the people that are seeking the power know inherently that the money will follow, but it's all about power. And of course, what these people want is a global agenda, a global government, where everybody in the world will be at the dictate of one world government. And this is why they chose global warming. Because here was a threat to the world, and they said, well, look, this is such a global threat that no one nation can deal with it. That way you eliminate nationalism, and you say, well, the only way you can deal with it is to have a global government. And that's exactly what Strong was saying, and what Elaine Dewar concluded after 5 days with him, talking to him about what he was doing. And I'll just repeat it again. Strong was using the UN as a platform to sell a global environment crisis and the global governance agenda. So what you need is one way to get people behind you is to create either an outside threat or an internal threat. I mean, all of these great leaders do this. With Hitler, it was the Jewish people that he was able to create this myth and claim that they were controlling Germany and the people. If you look at Idi Amin in Uganda, it was the Eastern Asians that were running the shops and running the businesses. They were the great boogeyman, and this is how they work. And so. What Maurice Strong and the people at the Club of Rome were saying was, look, the threat is the global warming, and I'll tell you how that came about. In 1968, the Club of Rome was founded by David Rockefeller in Rome, Italy, and they talked about all of these issues, and a lot of the names that you know today, like Paul Ehrlich and so on, were involved in this. Maurice Strong was a major participant.
Okay, you were talking about the Club of Rome, and you just cut off a little, Tim. Maurice Strong was a participant, you said. Continue from there.
Yeah. Okay, the Club of Rome determined that the world was overpopulated because they said that every citizen, no matter whether they were in a developed nation or undeveloped nation, every citizen was taking resources out of the earth. And that with the then world population of 5.5 billion, the world could not sustain that reduction of resources. So you saw terms like unsustainability and limits to growth that came out of the Club of Rome. And so what they argued was that they wanted to reduce the world population and to limit the damage being done by every single nation. But what they determined was, if you just go into a nation and say, look, you're using fossil fuel energy to develop, and that fossil fuel energy is causing global warming, we've got to cut off the fossil fuel energy. You see this going on in the States right now. This is the argument that's being put forward right now by the left in the U.S. Well, you simply can't get away with that politically. As you know, if the price of gasoline goes up a big jump, everybody's in arms about it. But what they determined was, and Maurice Strong and the gang determined was, if you could show that the byproduct of industry was CO2, and CO2 was a greenhouse gas that was causing runaway global warming, then you could use that as a lever to say, we've got to get rid of CO2, and therefore we've got to get rid of the industrialized nations. That's why CO2, even though it's only 4% of the total greenhouse gases, right? Water vapor is 95% of the greenhouse gases. You never hear that mentioned. That's why CO2 became the focus of all of this. And of course, this is what's going on right now, the focus on CO2 because of it producing global warming. Now, so the Club of Rome, with Maurice Strong, he said, look, I'll organize this and I'll get this going. He went to the UN, set up the United Nations Environment Program, and set up the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. But then what he did was, and most everybody's heard of the IPCC. The first thing that Strong did was, right, the first thing that Strong did was he set it up through the World Meteorological Organization. In other words, he set it up through a bureaucracy. The World Meteorological Organization is made up of the bureaucrats of every national weather office of every nation in the world.
Yeah, say that 3 times fast, won't you, Tim? You just cut out, and we know that those weathermen, how reliable they are. So it was purposefully set up.
But the thing is,
for this reason. I mean,
yep. Yeah, that was the whole point, was to put the whole thing in the hands of the bureaucrats, because then you get a politician who doesn't know anything about the science, and you see that all the time. I mean, how many politicians in any country are scientists? Virtually none. And so they Strong knew that the bureaucrats in these national weather offices could dictate the agenda. And this is why, by the way, you mentioned earlier in the program when Tony Heller and I went to Australia. We went there at the invitation of Malcolm Roberts. Now, Malcolm was a retired engineer and had started looking at the climate issue and couldn't believe what he was seeing. And this has happened a few times in my career. So he contacted me and said, look, is what I'm reading correct? I can't believe this is so bad. And I said, yes, it's exactly what you're seeing. And I said to him, look, there's 2 things that you've got to work on. One is you've got to stop or say to these people, show me the empirical data for global warming. Don't show me what a computer model is producing, because everything that's out there now is from a computer model, and the computer models don't work. That was your earlier reference to weathermen and how low the opinion people have of them. I mean, they can't even forecast for 3 days from now, and yet they're quite confidently telling you they know what's going to happen 50 years from now. And so we said, look, we want to know what. First, we want empirical data. The second problem we had was exactly what I'm talking about with Maurice Strong. You see, in every country in the world, as far as I've been able to determine, no citizen is allowed to challenge or talk to a bureaucrat directly. You have to go through a politician. So in order to challenge these bureaucrats that are putting out all of this misinformation about climate change, you have to do it through a politician. Well, the politicians don't know anything, and they're afraid to, because immediately they'll say, "Oh, you don't care about the planet, the children, blah blah blah," and they just back off. So what we did with Malcolm Roberts in Australia was, first we started asking for empirical data, real data, not computer model rubbish, and then Malcolm ran for office in Queensland. He ran for the Australian Senate as a senator from Queensland. He got elected, and it's very important for people to go and listen to his maiden speech in the Australian Senate about.
Yeah, we'll link him to that speech if you send me the links. Tim, you just cut out a little bit.
Okay, I'll send you the link. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I'll send you the link. It's under Malcolm Roberts, and also he then, as a politician, he was able to call these bureaucrats in front of commission hearings by the Australian government, and he started asking them direct questions about the data, and of course found out they knew nothing. They were simply repeating what they were getting from the United Nations, and of course. Malcolm was a senator for, well, I think just over 2 years, and he'd started to really make inroads confronting the bureaucrats head on. And all of a sudden, it was announced that he'd been thrown out of the Senate because he'd been elected illegally. And the illegal election was that he was a dual citizen when he ran for the Australian Senate. And it is illegal to be a dual citizen when you run for the Senate of Australia. But Malcolm knew this, and he had contacted the British government and said, "Look, cancel my British citizenship." He didn't know they hadn't done it. But in my opinion, what happened was the bureaucrats that he was confronting and exposing went and found this out, and so Malcolm got thrown out of the Australian Senate. Now, there were a couple of other people that were elected under the same problem, and they lost their seats. But there's no doubt in my mind that this was a move by the bureaucrats to shut Malcolm Roberts up. Now, since then, Malcolm has run again for the Australian Senate and is now back as a senator and challenging these bureaucrats head on. And that's what we've got to be able to do. We've got to find politicians who know enough and can have enough backing to be able to confront these bureaucrats who run this thing completely and without any attacks upon them. And so this is what we're working on.
Well, how does Tim? How does the Ipcc continue to perpetuate the fraud decades later, after all of us are calling them out on their lies, their fraudulent data, their manipulated data, and now they have, Tim Mann in his hockey stick with the manipulated data? Are these people simply getting bigger and bigger paychecks? Is that why they keep singing the tune? I mean, what is the incentive to continue to perpetrate the fraud? Why are all the people still employed at the Ipcc?
Well, of course, one of the problems that you get in any government, once you set up a bureaucracy, the first thing it does is make sure it perpetuates itself. I mean, in America, after the Second World War, you saw this proliferation of bureaucrats, they within 2 years they passed a third branch of the American legal system.
I love the way you beautifully put that about the bureaucrats. I think people need to listen more to what you have to say here. And you just cut out, so let's talk more about the bureaucrats and the problem.
Okay, Well, what happened in America, you've got civil law and criminal law, and after the Second World War, because of this explosion of bureaucracies, and you had all of these bureaucrats suddenly in charge of everything. And so what they did, by 1947, they introduced administrative law, which is the third branch of American law, which completely protects the bureaucrat. When Trump talks about not being able to get rid of these people, and Justice Scalia did it the same way when they were looking at the global warming issue, and he said, I have to rule under administrative law, and therefore there's nothing I can do about it. And so what these bureaucrats did was they brought in this whole third branch of law, which totally protects them. This is, as I said, try and get rid of a bureaucrat. Trump and the gang talk about it all the time, about how impossible it is. And so what you've got is the first thing they do is they get into power, they expand their power, they put walls around themselves, and then they then create their own agenda. And none of it's got anything to do with what the public need or want. In fact, if I was to take over a government, the first thing I do is get rid of about 90% of the bureaucrats. The bureaucrats have become the problem in today's world. That's the deep state, the unaccountable, self-sustaining deep state, and of course the fake news that they're created and perpetuating is the global warming issue and the environmental issues.
So let's talk, Tim. Let's talk about, as we close up now. Let's talk about some of the facts and some of your opinions. I'd like to know your thoughts on the climate cycles that we're currently living. It's my opinion that we're entering a period of quiet sun that will last probably through 2040, where the next 3 solar cycles will be weaker. We've reached the new cosmic ray maximum, and with the work of Svensmark and the cloud experiment at CERN, we know that will cause more cloud nucleation worldwide, larger hail, increased lightning, and we've begun to see an uptick in this worldwide, especially flooding. The 100 and 500-year floods are becoming more common. And this should increase through the next 3 decades. And at the same time, I don't know if you're aware of the waning magnetosphere and the fact that we are currently experiencing a magnetic excursion, and the magnetic field of the planet is actually weakening exponentially. What are your thoughts on that and the future of humanity with the globalist agenda to perpetuate global warming and the potential threat of climate catastrophes in the coming decades due to the exact opposite, a global cooling event?
Well, this is when politics gets involved in science, and science is going to lose. All of science is going to lose from this, because as the public start to see all of these predictions of doom and gloom and threat fail, you can define science in one word: prediction. If you can't predict, you don't have science. And of course, that's what the question I've always asked about weather and climate. How accurate are your predictions? Therefore, you don't have a science. And so my concern, as I said, is that all of these issues will get ignored as the public become increasingly cynical about climate and the environment. Now, the other side of this is for people to realize what I was talking about earlier about how society goes from a paradigm shifts. Environmentalism was chosen as a political vehicle. And I've given you the quote about Maurice Strong, but I've also mentioned the fact that Hitler was the first to use the environment for a political agenda. And he very deliberately did so. And of course, he very quickly abandoned the idea once he got all the power that he wanted. But he was the first one to make use of it. And what environmentalism, and it's hard for people to understand this, but it sounds like, well, it has a fundamental truth to it. And the fundamental truth is we should look after our planet. It doesn't make sense to soil our own nest. But that doesn't, that's a basic truth, but that doesn't encompass environmentalism. And when you start to look at all of the things that, and I mentioned earlier about Paul Ehrlich, 180 things that he predicted. Not one of them have come correct. You mentioned the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This was so deliberately politicized that when Maurice Strong set up the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, he limited what they could do. Now, the world thinks that the Ipcc, as it is looking at all of climate change. It isn't. It's only looking at human causes of climate change, because that's the definition that they were given by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1977. And so it's let me give you a specific example of this. One of the things that I use.
Tim, you were going to give us a specific example, and then you cut out. And I would really like to talk more about the environmental movement and how it's become actually a fraud. So, go ahead.
Well, it started out as a fraud because, of course, it claimed to care about the environment, but in fact, what it was doing was what's the original Chicken Little? The sky is falling. So the environment was the original and classic. The sky is falling to control people, and as I said earlier, these people were able to say, look, your own government can't protect you. You need a world government to do it, and so that's how that came about. But the environment was a paradigm shift that started on April 22nd. Of 1972, that's the original Earth Day, and it was Lenin's birthday, and that date was deliberately chosen by Paul Ehrlich. And Paul Ehrlich, who is still at Stanford University, has created all of this. He's the guy behind the Club of Rome, and he's the guy behind the overpopulation and all of the nonsense that you're hearing. And none of it bears any investigation. There's no evidence to support any of the threats that they talk about sea level rise, about desertification, about deforestation, and on and on and on, about melting of the permafrost and so on. Now, are these things occurring? Yes, but none of them at any abnormal rate. In fact, all of the changes that are occurring on the globe right now are well within natural limits and boundaries. But just to give you an example, we started on this with the Greenland ice sheet, right? Where they say, oh, there's 10 billion tons of ice melted in a single day on the Greenland ice sheet. Well, that's not abnormal. You can have last winter.
I love it.
Last winter, you had 11 billion tons of ice formed in one day, but nobody talked about that. And one of the things that people don't understand, and just to give you the larger example, we're using the ice caps. Glaciers are formed by snow that survives the summer, and then as the layers of snow accumulate, they build up. Once they get to about 50 meters of depth, or 150 feet, they start to compress with weight, and the lower layers form into ice. That's how a glacier is formed. And you've got two basic types of glaciers. You've got the continental glaciers like Antarctica or Greenland, and then you've got the alpine glaciers like you've got in the Rocky Mountains and the Columbia ice field. Now notice what I've said there. Nobody talks about the change in the glacier being related to differences in snowfall. Everybody says, oh no, the glacier is melting because of global temperatures. Most of the change in glaciers is due to changing snowfall, not temperatures. The temperature's got to change a great deal. And one of the ways we know this is when we do ice cores to determine the pattern of temperature in the past and also the pattern of CO2. they use that as it relating to temperature, but it isn't. It's precipitation. And that's the really important thing in what you're seeing with the glacier. And so, and second thing is that the continental glaciers, Greenland and Antarctica, most of the ice is already below sea level. Less than a quarter of the ice is above sea level. So even if those glaciers were to melt completely, the increase in sea level would be hardly measurable. Now, why do they say, oh, well, you see reports, oh, well, if Antarctica melts, there'll be 20-foot sea rise? Well, the reason the way they do that is they say, well, how much water is in Greenland and Antarctica? Well, if we melt that ice and there's the amount of water we've got, and we add that water to the current sea level, then that would raise sea level by whatever it is, 20 feet, 80 feet, whatever numbers you want to throw out there. But they forget, as I said, that 3/4 of that ice is already below sea level. And not only that, but the weight of the ice around the world pushing down on the crust of the Earth depresses the crust of the Earth and pushes the crust of the Earth down. So when you melt the glaciers away, the land rises up, and therefore it changes the capacity of the oceans to hold that water. So, it's just unbelievable, the lies that they're telling about glaciation. And
Tim, not only that, the amount of remaining ice on the globe is so insignificant. If we melt it all and put it into the oceans, people don't realize the volume of the oceans are so great that the oceans will not rise until thermal expansion occurs, which is delayed by hundreds of years. It's a thermodynamic principle. You could fill the ocean with all of the melted ice and it would barely rise just tens of feet until thermal expansion allows it to rise completely 100 years later. And this environmentalist fraud, I can't believe billions of people are duped. CO2 is plant food. It's only 4% of greenhouse gas. And not only that, we continue to reduce actual regulations on pollutants. We have the largest red tides and algal blooms ever seen worldwide because of agricultural runoff. The food we eat is food for sheep. It's all covered in glyphosate and other residues from the agricultural and big ag industry and chemicals. Dow Pharmaceutical basically runs the U.S. government. And this is all connected to the globalist agenda. Do you have any closing words? It's a pleasure to hear you speak tonight in such a candid way.
Well, if you look at the diet of hunter-gatherer people, that is people that live with on small animals and foodstuffs they gather off the land, as opposed to what's called sedentary agriculture, which of course is the main form of food supply in North America and Europe. A hunter-gatherer has 23 different food types in their diet. A sedentary agriculture person like you and I have a basic 5. And they're all heavy starches, the potatoes and the wheat and so on, and so this is how we have destroyed our diet by going for mass production, and instead of looking at the quality, we've gone for quantity, and I can understand why quantity was an issue, because you wanted more food for more people. But when you sacrifice quality for the sake of quantity, which is the point we're at now, you really need to rethink what you're doing. And so this is the concern that I have. And by the way, just to put the Greenland ice cap in perspective, they were complaining about 10 billion tons of ice melting in a single day, and as I said, that's perfectly normal at this time of year. It's warm, and so you get that much melt, but you get that equal amount formed in a single day in the winter time. But here's the interesting thing, that over a year, the Greenland ice cap loses 103 billion tons of ice, right? 103 billion tons in a year. But if the Greenland ice cap were to continue, that's the current rate of loss, because the world is warmer and the precipitation is different. But if that rate of loss of 103 billion tons per year was to continue into the future, it would take 12,500 years to lose half of the Greenland ice cap. That's how much ice there is in that Greenland ice cap. So this use of 10 billion tons of ice melting in a single day, it's just so it's almost criminal, the fake news and the selectivity of the data, simply to scare people.
Yeah, I can't agree more, Tim. I'm showing the data from the last year of the Greenland ice sheet, and back in mid-November, the ice sheet gained 12 gigatons on 2 separate days. One day it was 10 gigatons, and then a next day it was 12 gigatons. And also in the end of December, there was a day where over 8 gigatons were gained. And then even in mid-April, there was a 9 gigaton gain in April. And then at the end of April, there was a 5 gigaton gain this year, but that was never reported in the news. They reported this one drop off the last week of July, and that is it. And look, it's recovered back into multi-decadal norms.
Yep. Yeah. Well, of course, this is this is how you control people. You exploit their ignorance and their fears. And that's exactly what's going on with this use of the environment to scare people to death. And as I said, I really believe it's criminal, because I talk to a lot of these people and they know what they're doing. That's what really frightens me. I mean, Maurice Strong and all the people at the Ipcc, most of them know the truth. But, of course, the old story, oh, well, it's just a job and I need the job and blah, blah, blah. Yeah, but you're lying to the world. Yeah, have you gotten, by the way, I happen to think this complete loss of morality and ethics is what's wrong in America, and it's what leading to these shootings and the failure of Western civilization. And it was one of the funniest comments, or not funny, but peculiar because of who it came from. Osama bin Laden, before he died, he said, the West has lost its moral direction. And he was absolutely right. Absolutely right. But because it came from him, nobody paid any attention to it. But as I say, every single day I see more and more of this exploitation and of people's fear and greed, and it'll bring us down.
Well, it was an absolute pleasure having you on the show tonight. Guys, if you want to read more about what Tim has done in the last few years, check out his books. We'll leave you links below. The Deliberate Corruption of Climate Science, his 2014 title, and Human Caused Global Warming, the biggest deception in history. Him and Tony Heller went out to the Australian government. And real quick before we leave, let's talk about the court case. Yeah. Now, Tim is one of my heroes because he has spent over $500,000 of his own dollars defending himself against these pricks like Michael Mann and the Ipcc, and recently won. And now you're about to go into another case. Is that true?
Yeah, okay, just a couple of things to fill in. While we were in Australia, Tony and I and Malcolm Roberts got a call to go to talk to Myron Ebell, who was...
You said Byron Ebell, then you cut out.
He was asked by the Trump administration that was just coming in to do about the EPA, which of course Obama used as the bureaucratic control of his whole political agenda. And so we went directly to Washington and had a consultation. We told Trump, don't even attempt to argue the science. because first of all, you'll get tripped up so easily and made to look so stupid so quickly. But even if you do convince people, only about 20% will understand the science. 80% have no knowledge of science at all. But what we did was we said to him, look, what you're good at is getting out of bad deals, and the Paris Climate Agreement is a very bad deal. And we sent it to him, and he looked at it and he said, you're right, and he pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement. That has undercut things tremendously. But where were we going with all of this? Oh, so the environmental issue is kind of lost my train of thought here. Sorry, what was your question again?
Well, what I was most interested in is, and where you were getting is in the court cases.
Oh, the court case.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, the court cases. Yeah, I try not to think about them. Because I was so outspoken, and there was two things that I had that were going against me. One was they couldn't say I wasn't qualified, because I was qualified. And the second thing was that I have a God-given ability to explain complex science in a way that the public or people can understand. And I honed those skills teaching a science credit for art students for 25 years at the university. And so not only was I qualified to talk about what was going on, but also was able to do it in a way that the public could understand. And that scared them. So they had to shut me down. And what they did was there's a lawyer in Vancouver funded by a liberal group, and they brought 3 lawsuits against me. The one lawyer brought 3 lawsuits. All were brought by members of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Gordon McBean, who was the head of Environment, Gordon McBean, who was the head of Environment Canada and was the major participant in the formation of the Ipcc. And then Andrew Weaver, who served on 4 of the Ipcc reports because he's a computer modeler. And he brought a lawsuit against me. And then the third one was Michael Mann, of course, of the hockey stick fame, because
pricks like Michael Mann sue people like Tim Ball.
A lot of my own money. I've spent all of my own savings, but unfortunately, but it's all gone anyway, and I'm not complaining about that. I knew when I went into the lawsuits, but I have had tremendous support from people across the world to help me the legal bills, which by the way are now up to $800,000. I won. I of the 3 lawsuits, the first one I said I can't afford it and withdrew what I wrote. That turned out to be a good thing, because when the second lawsuit came along, my wife and I said, no, we're going to fight. We're not going to be illegally bullied anymore. And so the second lawsuit from Andrew Weaver, who, by the way, is now the head of the Green Party here in British Columbia and a member of the legislature. And we won that lawsuit against Weaver. Now he's appealed it, and we're in the courts again in December to deal with the appeal. We hope we can win the appeal. And then the third lawsuit by Michael Mann, the hockey stick guy, and the main part of that lawsuit was I had given a public presentation in Winnipeg, explaining what he had done, how he had literally rewritten the climate history book, changed the data, created this hockey stick. And after, with an interview by the media, somebody said, well, what should happen to him? And I said, well, he's at Penn State, but maybe he should be at State Penn. And within 12 hours, I had a third lawsuit on my hands. That one goes before the courts, is going before the courts right now. I think August 22nd, we're in Vancouver in the courts. But as I said, this has been $800,000 in legal bills so far, and will probably be twice that much by the time we're finished. But what people should be frightened about is this use of the law to silence people. People should look up what are called SLAPP lawsuits. That's an acronym for Strategic Lawsuit Against Public Participation. And these are so threatening to the law and society that many of the states are passing anti-SLAPP legislation because, as I said, it's using the law to silence people, and that's not what the law was designed to do. Well, I was the victim of 3 of those lawsuits.
Well, Tim, you're a legend in my eyes and many of our subscribers and fans. If you want to help Tim Ball out in his defense against the frauds, buy his books, and I'm sure you can donate directly to him. Tim, do you have a website?
Yes, I have a website, and there's 2 funds on there, PayPal funds. One is for the legal fund, and the other is for personal donations. Because, of course, it's very worrying when you have nothing in the bank at my age. And I've got no security at all. As I said, we're just living on pension. We've got a good life. We're not complaining, but that's the price you pay when you fight the system. It's drtimball.com. Oh, yeah. Well, as I said, people are starting to realize the fraud, and my concern is that don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There are issues we need to deal with, but we need to deal with them calmly and apolitically and have data. And one of the problems for the world is that we've got virtually no data. When you look at the United Nations or United States and the UN population agency, their estimate of world populations differ by 6 billion people. And yet those are the most sophisticated agencies in the world that are measuring that. So when you see data, I can tell you that virtually all of it is estimates and computer-generated data, and virtually none of it is reality. And so what we need to do is get much, much better and more accurate data about the world before we start panicking over anything.
Tim, it's been a pleasure. Guys, if you're watching, buy his books. Go to drtimball.com. Give him a donation for his legal support fund. It's been a pleasure. We'll have you back on the show shortly, Tim. And what's the title of your next book? Just give us a teaser.
Well, it's probably going to be environmental exploitation or something like that, just a simple title. But what I'm showing is that there's no data to support any of the claims, and so it'll be about 14 chapters. I hope to have it out in about 3 months.
Well, you better hurry up because sea level is about to inundate us. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Always a pleasure. Have a great night, Tim.
Thank you. Okay.